aboard!
Hey, what's up, everybody? You're listening to Cannabis Karaoke, where we ask you to grab the mic and tell your story. Get inside info from today's most interesting cannabis pioneers, and from the first note to the end of the song, listen up as you get to hear the stories of success on Cannabis Karaoke. Welcome back, people, to another episode of Cannabis Karaoke. Man, we've got a hot fire guest this morning with us, Steve Ernest. He's the Director of Business Development for Viridian Capital. And, you know, if you're in the cannabis space or wanting to be in the cannabis space or looking at the cannabis space, if you're not talking about the financial components of the cannabis space and the potential for investment, I must get asked a million times a week, like, where can I get in? Well, hopefully in this next 45 to 50 minutes, if I don't totally mess it up, Steve will give us the direction and the understanding of what does it look like in the cannabis market today in finance. Welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Danny. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. So, you know, I always kind of start the show off a little bit around, you know, explaining for me or anyways, like the listeners that we have, it's like, why cannabis? Like what? It's a white hot industry. Everybody knows it. Why did you choose to kind of leave what you were doing on a much larger scale? And it might be helpful for the listeners too, to give them a little bit of a background on what you used to do. And then what kind of motivated you to jump into this frenetic space, especially around capital?
Sure. It's a great question, Danny. So my journey into cannabis was for two primary reasons. I'd say there was a heavy social component, but also a heavy career component. So from a social component, I always have kind of inherently knew that cannabis was a much safer and more sustainable alternative from a recreational or relaxation perspective. I saw my friends back in Chicago, heavily drinking, and I was always the one who was like, "Hey, let's go, consume cannabis instead." And people who are drinking are always getting in fights and terrible hangovers and unproductive. And I always knew that there was kind of a large gap between the perceived risk and the actual risk with this plant. The second reason was more from a career perspective. I was working at JP Morgan, so I've been in the capital markets for over a decade now. I was on the wealth management side, so advising some of the wealthiest families in the country out of Chicago. And I started getting questions about cannabis. I knew that this was going to be an emerging field and that it was very likely headed in one direction, but I didn't know how. In addition to that, I was kind of looking around and I had a fairly quick rise up at JP Morgan. And, the guy next to me, his name was, Dick, and he was 88 years old and falling asleep at his desk. And I'm like, I basically have to work here for another 30 years to try to move up the ladder, where I saw an opportunity in cannabis to come in, work really hard, and become a thought leader and a perceived expert, which I don't think I could have done in the same way in a more mature industry.
What when you start looking at the space and you start looking at people's valuations and kind of how people are raising money, the structure of money, the frenetic energy around the money in this space and how people are investing. When you were first kind of dipping your toe in the space, having worked in a traditional finance atmosphere where things, I don't want to say the market is stable, but there's more predictability. There's more, kind of known hurdles that would present themselves. What are some of the things that you run into when you're trying to have a conversation with a potential person? And I obviously I know the sensitivity of what you know versus what you can tell us is great. Sure. But what about, were you completely surprised at some of the things that were kind of on the table when you first started?
Absolutely. The cannabis industry, especially when I entered, I think my first investment in the space in 2015. And, I kind of knew that the cannabis industry would continue to grow and evolve. I didn't know how though necessarily. So when I came into this space, my first investment was into a group called Canopy Boulder. And I liked that it was diversified and I could invest into 15 to 20 different positions because, especially in 2015, it was the wild, wild west. There was nothing historical to go on. So it was really just all the future, and was it a team who could build something that was going to benefit or add value to the cannabis supply chain going forward. So learned a lot by jumping in and starting to mentor companies from the angel investing round, that startup phase. So that was kind of how I entered into the space, and have learned an immense amount through that ecosystem. The second part of your question, I believe, was more on the valuation side of things.
Just, how were people coming to you when they were talking about, wanting to get an investment?
From all different angles. I mean, at Viridian, we see 1,000 business plans a year. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of business plans for the last 4 years in cannabis. I mean, you get it, you get it from all angles, man. I'll never forget one of the first investor, founder meeting I went to was up in Ashland, Oregon, and it was a guy who literally found his investor on Craigslist. He flew out, they came out, and I just sat there. And I mean, I watched these guys argue to the point where they almost got into a fist fight. I mean, it was they were just on such different pages. And, cannabis has everything from something like that, which is obviously, wildly unprofessional, to deals like Canopy and Acreage, right? Where, we're talking about major financial institutions. Goldman Sachs was the joint book runner on that. And, you're seeing huge, very sophisticated deals start to enter the space. So we're really starting to become a much more legitimate industry that institutional capital is starting to enter as a result.
Do you have like a clear path? At what point can you begin to wrap your head around where something's going to go when it comes to the market? Because, being in the market as long as we have, there's been a consistent and pretty, I don't want to say onerous, but intense set of changes that have come up with, it's always a bench test. Like, this is how you want it to work before it hits the market. And then there's the reality of how it really works.
Sure.
How does one future-proof themselves? And this is probably a horrible no answer question, but how does one future-proof themselves or really have an idea of what's going to work and what's not going to work? Or how are companies, and I'm sure you look at brands and testing labs and the spectrum of different opportunities to invest in. How are they future-proofing themselves when it comes to being aware of some of these changes, and not just in California, and if you're in cannabis right now, my 2 cents is, if you're not thinking about expansion into other states, then you probably should start if you listen to this and think about it. What are you seeing out there in the space? How are people acknowledging the potential hurdles that are coming up?
No, it's a great question. So I think the answer as far as foresight goes lies within corporate development. So again, cannabis is about the future, not the past, right? So you really need the right team to be able to take advantage and understand the steps that you need to take to attack whatever your target market is, right? So one of the things that we focus on immensely at Viridian is that corporate development piece. We want to put people who have, if you're in distribution, I want to take somebody who's been in distribution for, whatever, Constellation Brands or Diageo or a major multinational brand, and put them in a position to help that company establish and grow that footprint. So, it's becoming very institutionalized and complex, but I think, as it always has, including in the startup realm, it comes back to people, right? Who is the management team? Who are the people on the team that are going to take you from where you are now to where you want to be? I think a marquee example of corporate development is, again, by Acreage Holdings, bringing on John Boehner, right? You want to talk about how you navigate the regulatory framework of the United States, and get the ex-Speaker of the House on your team.
That's that's a really good point. I feel like when people jump into the space a little bit and they go to hire, they tend to hire nepotistically or off of close relationships. Mm-hmm. Where have you seen, and you don't have to list any names, but where have you seen some successes on, like you just pointed out, Acreage with Boehner? which doesn't always get them the best reception. I mean, I know that there were some challenges out at South by Southwest when he took the stage, and they were, he was kind of trying to speak his mind, and I think,
Sure. Sure.
for me, my evaluation is you almost have to have someone like that at the table in order to have legitimacy. When you approach something like that, or you are trying to give advice or ask questions of a particular investment opportunity, how much does that weigh into it? The ecosphere or culture of that particular company and how they're moving forward.
I think it's really important. Again, it's the team is. I mean, it's the most important thing. Do you have the right people who can get you to the next step? Right? You can show me any pro forma model that you want to, and tell me any narrative that you want to. But at the end of the day, I have to believe that the people that you have within your ecosystem are going to be able to execute on your vision. So I think that, and to your other point, as far as people booing John Boehner, right? I think there's a growing dichotomy of ideology happening within the industry right now, where old cannabis is starting to butt up against new cannabis, which they were ultimately compensated for two very different reasons. I think the years of cannabis past, people were compensated for their ability to assume risk, and the years of cannabis future are going to be compensated for their ability to enter into new highly regulated markets. So, sure, we can all sit here and boo John Boehner for being a hypocrite and spending his career on, becoming anti-cannabis. But at the same time, we need guys like him in order to expand cannabis in the way that I think a lot of the early founders, envisioned cannabis would be available and ubiquitous across markets. So I think you have to have a mix, and ultimately it just comes down to having the right folks on the train.
And the next question our statement maybe that you'll speak to is, you're 100% right. I mean, I feel that it's almost like the door opener, right? Like that person is going to open door to success.
Mm-hmm.
But how does a company deal with that pushback from the core? It's such a divided group of people with the legacy of people that have either grown or sold or used or whatever. They feel betrayed, I guess. Can you help some people understand why they should forego that feeling per se? Because without the help, we're not going to move forward. And sometimes you have to make considerations in order to move forward. And I see that being one of those considerations. How do you calm down a potential project or investment that you're going to be working on who's adamant against or for staying true to the base and holistic, I guess would be a good word?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that ultimately you have to have some authenticity to your brand and your messaging, right? I mean, you look at Acreage. Acreage wasn't a grower up in Humboldt or the Emerald Triangle somewhere just trying to make it big. They started as a big corporate player, right? So yeah, they're going to obviously piss off some of the historical growers who have been doing this for 20 years and providing this medicine and this plant in the shadows. But I think that the people who are going to survive the transition from tie-dyes to ties are the people who are strong enough and emotionally sound enough to challenge their own core belief systems and understand that the industry is shifting and they have a valuable skill to provide, but not necessarily in the way that they always envisioned it. So it's a transition, but there's got to be, the successful people are going to be able to make the compromise in order to try to sit down at the table with the guys like John Boehner, see eye to eye, and see how they can work together.
I think you may have just coined a phrase.
Which one?
Tie dyes to ties. Is that something? Is that something being used out there, or did you just pop that out?
I don't know. I just,
Man,
off the cuff.
I wrote it down. I was like, I got to write that one down. So I mean, that's a good segue into kind of my next question, and it's kind of taking it from the other angle, which is, how does a person like John Boehner come in? How does he go from tie to tie dyes? How do you see the people that, let's just say for sake of this discussion, they were, I don't want to say they were adamantly against it, but they weren't necessarily a champion or pioneer for it. But now that it's here, they're ready to play. What does that person see? How are they having to make adjustments into this space, which is not traditional?
Sure. I think it's both parties need each other at the end of the day, right? So what John Boehner doesn't have is he doesn't have the experience or the relationships of being boots on the ground in a place like California, right? So although he's certainly top of the chain, has massive exposure, I'm sure ridiculous connections from an investment and a regulatory perspective, the things that he doesn't have are people who understand who the buyers are at all the dispensaries in Sacramento, right? Or in Nevada, or any of the places that are likely target growth markets for acreage. So he's and ultimately he's probably not the guy at the table anyway. He's a face, right? He's a face. He's on the board. He's not as nearly as involved as I think people perceive him to be, right? They're just using his name to kind of market him, I think, more than anything. But he needs to be able to, and again, not necessarily John himself, but Acreage, they need to be able to sit down and have those conversations with the people who have built relationships over the last 10 years in order to integrate into the existing and continually growing market. So I think the onus flies on both ends. And I think that the people who are most successful are the people who are going to be able to sit down, make some compromises, challenge some of their own core beliefs, and work together.
It's almost like you need an interpreter, because the money people, if you will, are sometimes speaking a different language than the people looking for the money. Like I know we both have sat in meetings where we hear data from somebody or they make a statement and you're like, nah, that's not really what's happening here.
Right. Yeah, sure.
How does, like, if I'm a brand, right? Am I small brands, obviously, by the way, are probably not going to attract the likes of a John Boehner, but there are other types of experts out there. When you're a small brand and you get past a certain point, I mean, I have seen, as you have, people start companies and jump out there with no revenue or even concept, but with just any proof, just a concept to get funded, and they've been funded. But how does a brand know when it's the time to start funding, and what's the best way? And it's more specific to cannabis than traditional, because I believe there's different triggers.
Sure. It's a good question. So the question is just how do brands start in the industry, and is it more around when do they start to raise?
I think it's a combination of when and what's the best way. Like when you're ready to go for money. Because let's just be honest, most of these new brands have not had a chance to be a startup, possibly, or even raising funds on the back of a startup. So sometimes, and I know that Viridian has a threshold as far as like what they'll look at and what they won't look at. So you guys are a little bit more fortunate in that fact. But if you're a brand, and let's just say put on a different hat of like the independent investor who is going to be an angel round, or maybe even friends and family, what is a brand's best path to success to get to talk to a guy like yourself eventually, to be sophisticated enough to have enough funds to be able to progress your company? Sure.
It's a very complex answer, but it has to do with kind of climbing the capital ladder, right? So, again, when I made my first investment into Canopy Boulder, I was an angel investor, right? It was 15 to 20 companies get 20 to 30 grand, which, as you know, as an entrepreneur, goes very, very quickly, right? So it takes that financial prowess to be able to utilize resources effectively enough to continue to show existing investors and new investors that you have a vision, you have a plan, you're executing on it, and you know what you're talking about. Viridian is an investment banking group, right? So, we're not angel investors, right? We're not trying to seed somebody with 50 or 100 grand to see if they can build something that gets enough traction then to bring in, some more angel investors, essentially. We're more on the institutional ladder where we're starting with Series A, Series B, and trying to work with companies to get them to some kind of liquidity event. So when you're starting out early, that's why they call them angels, right? Because it's, somebody coming in and really giving you a gift. From an angel investment perspective, when you make that investment, you kiss that money goodbye, right? It's you're not hoping, you're not asking, oh, when's liquidity, and are you going to pay me a coupon, right? It's, I'm the first money in because I believe in forcing you, right? You don't have anything. You don't have a brand when you're just out there raising capital, trying to get them enough money to, buy packaging. I will say, from a branding perspective, I think it's becoming much more challenging in the industry to start a business, because you have just a lot more barriers to entry as the industry continues to institutionalize. So, back in the day in Prop 215 in California, I mean, you could go up to Humboldt, you could buy a jar of extract for $500, and go to, Whole Foods and, buy some ingredients, infuse some cookies, and sell them into a dispensary. Cost of capital to start, I mean, you're talking about $1,000 get you going. Not the case anymore in a regulated market. Now we're talking about, tobacco, alcohol rules. You want to start a brand, you got to get licenses, you got to get permits, you have to have a manufacturing facility, you have to get lab testing, which can be very expensive. So, brands were much easier to start and bootstrap in the early days. Now, I don't know, I don't want to peg a specific number on it because it's very market dependent. But you've got to start with, I'd imagine, at least 6 figures to be able to just put the pieces in place to sell one product.
Yeah, I mean, I think, would you agree that a year in cannabis is what exponential, would you say? Like,
dog days.
So yeah, right. 1 to 7. Like,
Yeah.
If you've made it a year, it's like you made it 7 years. And not only did you make it 7 years, but the person behind you is never going to probably catch up. Like the brands that you're seeing starting to emerge now, seeing a lot of like celebrity endorsed brands starting to come on market, and they're partnering with some of the bigger MSOs and firms to facilitate those things. So you're starting to see the shift from, to your point, getting a batch of oil and going and buying some cookies and just infusing them, to becoming a little bit more of, not even becoming, it is more of a regulated space that automatically kind of shifts the opportunity for people to enter. You made a couple statements around some words. I always try to be clear with the listeners so that anybody that's not educated in whatever we're talking about, we can kind of help educate them. So can you do me a favor and not, without trying to get too remedial, just break down, like, angel investors, friends and family, angels, and then the series rounds, and kind of what those dollar amounts look like? Because, and you don't have to get, like I said, it doesn't have to be a full lesson in the breakdowns, but I think people would be interested to know. I know I've heard people come to me and say, "Hey, I'm looking for investment." And I'm like, "What round are you in?" They're like, "Raising money round." So if you don't mind, impart a little bit of guidance on some of our listeners.
Absolutely. So, then that's really the role of an investment banker, is to guide somebody along a capital cadence that ends up in liquidity, right? And making your shares and all of the things that you're trading, money for shares or debt, worth cash again at the end of the day. So that ladder starts with friends and family, right? So you call people who've known you for a long time, because again, it's trust in the entrepreneur, right? When you're first starting a business and you've got a pitch deck and a dream, it's got to be someone who trusts you and knows you. They're betting on you, nothing else, right? And that changes as you get traction. So in the beginning, your friends and family round, maybe you're raising 50 or 100 grand. I mean, I've was with a group in New Orleans, and they're very successful entrepreneurs, seems like they're from some wealthy backgrounds, and they raised $5 million in friends and family. So it's a wide range, and it really just depends on the amount of resources that you need to just build what I refer to as a minimum lovable product. So the Silicon Valley term is minimum viable products, but you want to put something out there that people are at least going to love, hold on to, buy, and ideally continue to repeat buying. So that's your friends and family round. Then you move into your angel round, right? And angels is basically just very wealthy people, called an accredited investor, which essentially means they make over 250 grand a year, or their net worth is above $1 million. And having folks like that who then say, okay, you've built something, you've got a little traction, maybe you have a product I can hold in my hands, maybe have a website or a service that I can click through and actually do something with. And they say, okay, I'm going to put some more capital in. And from a range perspective, again, it's very wide, right? I mean, you see angel investing rounds from whatever 50 grand all the way up to, again, multiple millions of dollars. The pre-seed ranges are really just whatever amount of money you need to create your minimum lovable product. After that, you move into your series rounds. So then your series A, B, C, D, E, whatever, maybe some bridge rounds in between. But those series rounds, that is to facilitate growth capital, right? So that's saying, hey, I've got this minimum lovable product. People are using it, but I need infrastructure. I need a sales team. I need new buildings or offices or equipment in order to scale my production and my distribution. So it's about consistently using the right tools, raising the appropriate amount of money so that investors at every round continue to see the valuation of their investment go up, and you're continuing to fund the business with what it needs and not frivolously spending exorbitant amounts of money that you don't need. So it's not a simple answer, right? At the end of the day, we're talking about capitalism, which I consider to be the Olympics of money. So everybody wants money, right? This is the fastest way to create wealth, and that's why it's so incredibly nuanced.
When I know when people are looking for capital or they're looking to raise money, and it's an uncomfortable position to be in. I look at, there's like really two or maybe three types of people in the way they handle money. There's people that look at it as a value of currency and understand that currency, but also understand that their options are currency, their stock is currency, their networking is worth currency. And then you have people that are just timid of raising money at all necessarily, or they feel guilty, or they feel like they're a failure because they have to raise money. How do you not, and again, this is for the bear, some of the listeners are not sophisticated investors. And a lot of the questions I usually get around investment are people that want to do something, but don't know how to do it.
Sure.
What, let's just say the person's made it through their rounds and they're now sitting in Steve's office. Mm-hmm. What kind of relationship to capital do you look for with that particular team around how, everybody's got their perspective of how much to spend on marketing or how much to spend on staff or technology or whatever. But there's some people that you see that glint in their eyes that they know as soon as they close that round, there's a party coming on the backside of that round. How do you sniff that out so that you don't get somebody that's just irresponsible, that can put up a good game, but that's irresponsible once they get funded?
Sure. I think that it ultimately comes back down to experience, right? It's much, much easier to get investment when you have already successfully done something before. So when we look at management teams and I see somebody who's had 2 exits before this, huge feather in your cap, right? Because as an investor, I want liquidity. That's the goal, right? Of course, I want to support the team and the vision and the entrepreneurs, and it's exciting, and I love all that stuff. But the main goal is to eventually receive money back from the money that I give. So when I see somebody who has that experience, I'm much more likely to place capital. And I would advise entrepreneurs who, if you don't know, if you haven't done this before, find an advisor. You can give a percentage of your company. You can give up whatever, quarter point, half point, full point, depending on where you are in your life cycle of your company. But if you can get somebody on the team who can advise you on how to structure this, even having that person on your pitch deck and saying, wow, you've got an investment banker who's taken, 2 companies public before, or has worked in M&A for 10 years. It provides a lot of confidence to the investor to say, this person isn't just going to raise a couple $1 million, have some, great party, enjoy networking for the next 2 years and close up shop, right? So I think it does come back down to the team.
One of the next question I'm going to ask you has nothing to do with what we've just spoken about. It's actually more of I want to hear what you have to say about it. So typically, Wall Street guys have not been people that smoked weed or consumed cannabis. Mm-hmm. How does the relationship to cannabis impact the traditional office mentality around what up until now has been considered a taboo drug? how is that? How do you mix cannabis and finance? How does not necessarily Steve per se, but how does a financial representative go into the market of cannabis? I tell you what, if you're sitting at a table and that joint comes to you and you don't smoke that joint, it's going to be a little weird.
Sure. I think that
Because you're cannabis out. Like there's no secret. You're using cannabis. They know.
I think it's a misconception, and the reason that it's a misconception is, so I'm licensed with the SEC, right? So I have to get everything that I do cleared by my broker dealer. So historically, there has been such an incredible stigma around cannabis that it really has never made sense for any financial professional or attorney or CPA or anyone who's regulated by a board that's likely conservative and is not going to be understanding of the consumption of this particular substance. It doesn't make sense to ever declare that you're consuming cannabis. I mean, I had to hide in the shadows for 10 years, and nobody would have ever known that I consumed cannabis. Obviously, I've been in it for almost 5 years now, and the Google Steve Ernest cannabis, it's going to pop up, which kind of at least temporarily ended my chances of going back to Wall Street, which is totally fine. But I think there's many more financial professionals who consume cannabis than people think that there are, as a result of having to, avoid punitive measures.
Yeah, because up until now, even if you were in a traditional business, you weren't necessarily even cannabis out then. And I had similar reaction to when the LinkedIn profile changes to cannabis. All of a sudden, you get hit from both sides. You get from people going, "You're the biggest idiot in the world. What are you thinking?" To, "Wow, how do I get in?" Right? It's such a crazy set of circumstances that happen once you kind of are forward with your cannabis use. I mean, there's the questions being asked on Little League fields. I'll just leave it at that. So
yeah, sure.
I want to kind of get a little bit salacious right now. I know I promised I wouldn't. I promised I wouldn't get crazy. But there was a bit, and I usually don't talk about things on the show that time date us, but good gosh, there was a bomb that dropped today. Bruce Linton, Canopy Growth, co-CEO, claims he was fired. What is going on there?
Well, I actually have not.
Did I get you?
You did get me on that one. No, I haven't caught up my daily news. I usually do that in the evenings. That's obviously big news. I don't know the validity of it, obviously, but at the same time, at some point, the person that takes a company from nothing up into something is likely not the person who's going to take it from something into a global market leader, right? So you see this change up in boards and executive teams all the time. So think of it like this. Think of JP Morgan, right? It was started by J. Piermont Morgan in, 1800 something. It's run by Jamie Dimon now. There's not a single person, as a result of obviously being one of a 150-year-old financial institution, who was on that original team. And that original team may not have even been the right people to take it to what it is now, where there's 270,000 employees. So as we continue to see the consolidation in the cannabis industry, you are undoubtedly going to see shifts at the top, as well as throughout the entire hierarchy of companies. So I don't know the reasons why, but just on its face, it doesn't surprise me.
And I want to dovetail that. Yeah, it's in reading it, it's been kind of hopping around the space. Obviously, I mean, Canopy Growth, for those that are listening, is probably one of the first big moves, like with Constellation Brands putting $4 billion into them.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, that was a big story then, and I think that's a good point. I want to try to get a little bit more out of you about, because founders, right? There's this term called founder syndrome, and it tends to be the cancer that kills a company if they are not forcibly removed. How does one have their ego in check to realize that there's a bigger picture, but at the same time know when to pass that baton?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's so founder dependent. I mean, you want to look at Uber with was it Travis Kalanick, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but obviously built one of the biggest companies of this generation, and was ousted, right, as CEO. So I think you have two options. I think you have the foresight to sit down at the table and have positive negotiations with the people who are ultimately going to take over and do the things that you might not be capable of, or the alternative, which is you get pushed out, which I would imagine is not as beneficial of a way to go. So I think it's important to talk to your investors, and as it becomes more institutional, your board of advisors, your general partners of the funds that are invested into you, and make sure that you're aligned with your values and have those very transparent and open conversations, which again, much easier said than done. I mean, you're a founder. It's your baby, man. This is like you given blood, sweat, tears, your whole life to this thing, right? So there's a huge emotional component there that you have to get through. So I don't think there's a simple answer there. But again, it's challenging your own core belief systems and asking yourself important goals, such as, what do I want to get out of this, right? When I started this, what did I want to get out of this? Did I want to get be worth $10 million, right? Or not not have to work anymore, or be able to start my own venture capital fund or philanthropy fund. What are your goals and how are you achieving them with the group of people that you've decided to work with?
How does somebody like obviously Bruce did not start in his garage like with an idea. I assume I'm assuming they were fairly well along when they started going. But how does you almost have to go in with the mindset, right? When you start a company that I don't think enough people ask that question that you just mentioned, which is, what do you want to do? I always liken it to a 6-year-old saying they wanted to be a firefighter. And it's like, that's great, but there's a lot of in between that needs to take place in order for you to become a firefighter. What's the best advice you can give somebody if you were able to like give a pre-founding a company advice to somebody or to our listeners around what's the mindset? How do they reverse engineer? What would you give them advice around?
Good question. So I think I learned a lot of this in my wealth management days back at JP Morgan. But when somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want to raise capital for my business, I don't know what kind of terms I can raise it at. The thing that I like to ask first and start backwards from is, what are your goals? You want to end up with $5 million at the end of this thing? Okay, well then let's structure a capital cadence with that geared in mind, right? What are your goals? There's an interesting relationship with the utility of money that people have. So at a certain point, money begins to actually detract value from people's lives. And I think people get so caught up in the mix of entrepreneurship and the irrational exuberance of the cannabis markets that they look at Canopy Growth and say, oh my God, I could be, $100 million, or I could be a billionaire if I do this. And, they get caught up in that and kind of ignore the core belief that they started with. So, again, it's an emotional component, right? And I think entrepreneurs need to take a hard look at what they're doing, how much they're sacrificing for it, and what realistically they think they want or need to be happy, and work backwards from there. So it's a qualitative exercise that I think too few entrepreneurs are going through.
Yeah, because even though you mentioned earlier I think the reason some brands or companies may struggle in the fundraising game is because you mentioned it earlier. If a company has done a couple exits or completed a couple deals, then they have some feathers in the cap. They've kind of almost ran the race versus this person that's showing up as the first race. I think as a founder myself, the way that I've always approached companies that I've ran or started was you should always, number one, bring people that are smarter than you around you so that you can have more stable success. And two, know when you've hit that ceiling and have you ever had episodes where you've had a company that was coming to invest that you recognized right out of the gate, or it was I guess in general recognized right out of the gate that this current C team had hit its ceiling, but the investment possibility was there, but in order to make that investment do what you figured it should be doing, you had to replace the whole C-suite. How does that conversation take place, and does it? And then you don't have to give us examples, but it can be a deal killer.
Absolutely can be a deal killer. I'd say that what it revolves around is authenticity of communication. If I'm going to invest into a company and I say, you guys are, okay, I'll invest in your, maybe your friends and family round or your Series A, but you guys aren't really the Series B, Series C team. You're not going to take it public. I want to hear from the entrepreneurs what their mentality is surrounding that, because at the end of the day, you can't change other people, right? It's hard enough to change yourself, right? So if you recognize that as a potential flaw in the capital cadence towards liquidity, I think it's very important to state that and be in agreement that when the time comes, we are going to look for people to help guide this company towards liquidity, right? And you might not be the right guy. You can even write that into your contracts, right? Getting a board seat as an investor and saying the board will just decide who remains on the executive board. I've seen it where an investor will say, I'm on the board, you're on the board, and then one person that we slept together are on the board. And if we go to the Series B and there's somebody who's a better fit for this, for the CEO, not to say that we don't want you to participate, because certainly you want the founder team to participate in the capacity that adds the most value. But it also should be transparent enough to say, when the time comes, if we can find someone who can guide this company to something bigger than what we can do with ourselves, we should make that move. And being in agreement on that, I think, is the best place to start.
A lot of companies are formed with all the best intent. People jump in together, they're buddies, they went to high school together, college together, their wives
Yeah.
or their husbands are friends,
Mm-hmm.
and then shit hits the fan. The founders are fighting after an investment round. What's your role in that? How do you guys calm that down? And what's the best advice you can give?
Sure. I think that comes to something you said earlier, which is nepotism, right? So a lot of times people will say, hey, I've got some great friends and, we all work really well together, and let's see if we can combine our skills and make something. I think the better approach is when somebody says, I have a vision of what I want to build, and I'm going to find the right people in order to build this, as opposed to, it's bottom up versus top down, right? So I'd rather see somebody say, I'm starting with the idea, and then we're going to fill the seats and build a team that's going to be able to execute this vision, then go bottom up and say, hey, I've got these people. I wonder what we can do together to build, to make something work.
What does Steve? What type of cannabis product does Steve use? Don't list any brands. Just and
Sure,
what's
sure.
kind of your flavor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've had such an interesting journey with cannabis. Obviously, being a consumer for many years at this point, and in the beginning of my journey, it was down to accessibility, right? So funny story. When I was in Chicago and I used to consume cannabis, I actually had an asthmatic response, and what I found out later on, because at one point I was extremely disappointed because I thought I was allergic to cannabis. Turns out I'm just allergic to mold, so I was smoking mold, which is a problem, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to argue that this is a medicinal. The plant is so holistic, but I'm sitting here, dying of an asthma attack because I'm smoking mold. So in the beginning, availability, it was you'd smoke whatever anybody in the world could get you, periodically, right? Then I moved to San Francisco, right? And I had access to the coolest, most innovative products, right? From edibles to topicals to tinctures to dabs. And I really went deep down the rabbit hole. And I tried, a little bit of everything. And what I found is that, it's kind of a bell curve. And I've navigated back to just good flower. And I love to just smoke good flower, out of a bubbler or, some kind of water piece to maybe, clean or cool down the combustion a little bit. And I found that the reason for that is what's referred to as the entourage effect. So it's the mixture of cannabinoids working in conjunction with each other to provide that really pure high that I think that cannabis consumers are so drawn to. I think when you use, extracts or even edibles, it's not as dynamic of a feeling and of a result. So yeah, I'm back to flower, man. I love people who can grow just very high end, beautiful, fresh, terpene rich flower, and that's what it is.
Is it a joint, a bong, a pipe? Like, how are
Bubbler,
you?
man. I'm a double bubbler guy. I've had a double bubbler for like 15 years. I don't know. It's my tool of choice. Most people don't even know what that is, but it's basically just a glass piece with 2 compartments for water. So it goes through water once, goes through water twice, and then you inhale.
Nice.
Yeah, man. That's my jam.
When you're at a cocktail party and you're off work and someone's approaching you about the cannabis space, it doesn't even have to be about investment. What's your outlook on it?
Outlook in regards to
Just where it's going, the just a general 50,000 foot like viewpoint of where new states opening, new categories opening, the like.
So it's institutionalizing. So the years of cannabis past was underground and incredibly fragmented. At the end of the day, upon legalization, capitalism drives value to consumers. They want the best quality product at the best possible price, right? That intersection of quality and price is value. And the goal is to, give consumers as much value as possible. So, to the chagrin of, I think, many of the, OG growers up in Humboldt, we're going to have mass standardization. We're going to have corporations come in with SOPs and human resources. And it's just going to continue to expand because you're going to have brands that have consistent experiences. So you're not going to have the old college brownie where someone says, "Hey, man, try this brownie. What's in it? I have no idea. Just take a bite and then take another bite in a half hour and see what happens." When you eliminate that and you say, "Here's a 5 milligram, French macaroon," right? It's like, oh, that's so approachable, right? And you're not going to have a bad experience. So it's going to continue to march across the country and across the world. But one of the things that I'm noticing in the industry right now is Chicago. So I'm originally from Chicago. So I go back, fairly often, at least, 5 times a year. And I'm noticing that Chicago actually has all of the components that the cannabis industry needs to continue to build itself. So when you look at the top brands out of Chicago, there's Walgreens, Procter and Gamble, McDonald's, right? Huge retail, huge manufacturing, huge distribution. A lot of liquor distribution companies are out of there. That's what Chicago does really well. And as a result, you've quietly seen 5 of the 10 biggest multi-state operators headquarter themselves in Chicago. They have cheaper buildings or cheaper real estate than Manhattan or San Francisco or LA. And they have access to high quality talent that is needed to build these kinds of businesses. The insurance people, they've got accountants, lawyers, bankers. So you're starting to see the Midwest really take hold. And I don't know if you noticed, but New Jersey and New York just kind of flubbed their votes, and now recreation is a question mark again. After where J.B. Pritzker in Chicago has fully legalized and said, "Hey, we're marching forward." I think we're going to see Chicago emerge as a major hub for cannabis.
I also really appreciate them tying in the expungement of cannabis-related offenses.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I think is a thing too that we need to really remember, that there's people still doing time for the plant while we all make money, and the likes of John Boehner are sitting on boards. We can't forget the reason why we came into this space was because we wanted to help people, and the people that were helping people before we realized that we needed to legalize helping people, those people are still paying dues. So, that's just my 2 cents. And I was really appreciative when I saw them pass their laws that they were incorporating that as part of it. And I'd like to see more states take that approach.
So I sit on the finance committee for an organization called the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And on that committee, I sit with a gentleman named Chris Crane, who I have a huge amount of respect for, been an activist in the industry for over 20 years. And he is the president of, I think, Forefront Ventures. He moved to Chicago, and he was very active in writing or helping lawmakers craft this legislation. So there are people who are extremely passionate about this, working tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure that things like expungement, get written into the legislative pieces. So, these are the activists, and I think the kind of unsung heroes of the space who are really getting in there and sitting with the capitalists and can speak, both languages, like we said earlier.
Yeah, I think we're just 1 year equals 7 years is what we'll just go back to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to give you a chance to let people know where they can lurk you. So let people know your LinkedIn, your Twitter handle, maybe throw out Viridian stuff. And then, people, if you are looking for serious financing, this is definitely one of the places that you should stop and at least check out. And at least be looking at some of the investments they're making to see if you fit before you reach out. So if you don't mind, just go ahead and shout out some of the social locations, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, I'd say the best way to reach me is, certainly on LinkedIn, Steve and Ernest, again, work for Viridian Capital Advisors. If you go to viridianca.com, we've obviously got a website set up, and we have surveys listed on the website. So if you're looking for investment or looking to place capital or acquire a company, fill out one of the surveys on the website. It goes directly to me, so I'll be able to take a look at it.
Thanks, Steve. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I learned a lot today, and I hope everybody else is enjoying this as much as I did.
All right, Danny. Love you, buddy. Talk soon.
Thanks, Bo. That's a wrap. Thank you for listening to this edition of Cannabis Karaoke, another kick-ass podcast about all things cannabis. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and our website, cannabiskaraoke.tv. And if you or someone you know would like to be on the show, please hit the book your interview button on the right. Cannabis Karaoke. Grab the mic and tell your story. Wow!